remotely. We are starting today's lecture, which is special for two reasons. One, this is the anniversary lecture because we started last October 2018. So in that sense, we have come a full circle. The second reason is that we are following up on the topic we were discussing earlier across the hallway on the freedom of thought and freedom of speech. And the third thing, not necessarily in order of importance, is that the title of today's talk connects back to the title of that first talk last year. The one last year was Escape from Ego, and today's talk is Otherness, theirs and ours. When we talked about Guriz as Manyat, or Escape from the Ego, last year, nobody else has asked a question for the whole year. So if you escape from the ego, where do you go? And so today we're trying to find out, where do we go? The understanding, ideally, is that you deny the ego within. You destroy your nafsaniyat. You try to become nothing so that the divine, that is everything, will be acknowledged in its totality. You become nothing so you can acknowledge and understand God to be everything. But that doesn't necessarily always happen that way. So sometimes when you're in the ego, you're kind of in the limelight. You and everything else you perceive seems to be paying attention to you. You matter and nothing else matters. Now, if you're in the limelight, what about the rest of the world? The rest of the world is in the dark, because you don't see anything but yourself. Now, if you deny yourself, but the light is still on you, then you still don't see anything outside of you, except that you see them in the darkness. And when you see other things in the darkness corresponds to its negativity. You were all the positive, everything else was negative. You stop thinking of yourself as positive, but you have not given up seeing everything else as negative. And so long as you see everything else as negative, that is the otherness we talk about. You have not left here. You have an imprint of that self still operating at some level. So in psychology, we call something like the shadow self. And since I'm giving you the metaphor of light and darkness, I think the shadow makes perfect sense, that you are still in the shadow. And that shadow still has the darkness, it still has the negativity. And the way we operate in that is that we go back to three basic questions. Those questions are, who are you? And what are you? The who are you part of it is the one that deals with identity. Who? The response is identity. And the what deals with your entity. Entity comes from the Latin et at the beginning, the beingness of something. In Persian, you would say hast, hasti, hastudan. So that hast, whether you have it with ha or with aleph, it's still the same thing. So we will deal with the entity part of it a little bit later. We will start with the identity. And sometimes you wonder whether the words that were coined in these different languages, did they really carry a hidden message within them? How do you spell identity? With what letter? And I is the I, which the eye doesn't see. And so when we spell I, how do you spell it grammatically, syntactically? You spell it with a lowercase or uppercase? Always. The only two pronouns we spell in the uppercase is I and any pronoun that refers to God. So where did we put ourselves? Right next to God. We capitalize any word, any pronoun for God, whether it's he, she, it, or any other. Out of respect for God, it's capitalized. But no other pronoun is capitalized except I, which is the I, which is the self, which is the ego, still dominant. And so we have, in a way, subconsciously equated ourselves with God, not knowing that it is just stylistics or grammar form that we use. So, in that identity, once you put the I, what does that leave outside of it? Everything else. And we live in the in the identity we live in the sense that we try to build walls of different forms to separate the I from everything else. So we could act in a way like, let me just explain the distinction between entity and identity one more time. Entity doesn't have that. You never capitalize the E part of it. The ET, which means is in Latin, that is the way you are, and that's it, nothing more than that. And if you look at in nature, the nature generally does not deal with identity. Put yourself in the position of, let's say, an eagle. So there's an eagle on top of a mountain, looking down upon busy city streets where there are thousands and thousands of people milling around, going about, doing business, going to restaurants, eating, basically surviving. What the eagle sees is the entity of the people. They are living beings who are just trying to survive. Where does the identity come? The eagle has no idea that these thousands of people who are milling around have names. They don't know that humans have names. And does that matter? Yes, very, very much. Everything has to do with the name. Everything. All the miseries that we have around the world have to do with names. First, when someone calls your name, it is you. And you have been named to distinguish yourself from everyone else. So that's wall number one. You are different than everyone else. Then you go to the next level. What is the name? So your name could be George, Muhammad, Chong, Kumar. There are all sorts of names, right? And every one of those names carry with it a baggage. The name defines you culturally. The name defines you linguistically. The name defines you religiously. The name defines you in terms of nationality. That name that you thought didn't really matter, matters so much. And that's why we often see people who move from one culture to another, they often change their names. What for? Because they want to be accepted in this new culture. In Hong Kong, most Chinese in Hong Kong have two names. An English name, because it was a British colony, and a Chinese name. And depending on which name you call them with, carries with it a whole lot of meaning there. We have many Muslims, I'm sure you've heard all those examples. So the naming makes a lot of difference in terms of whether you're accepted in a particular country, say as a refugee, which is pretty common these days. It also shows a perception within a particular culture. Let's see, for the sake of the majority of the audience here, if you're born in today's Iran, whether your name is Dariush or Hussein, makes a lot of difference, doesn't it? It makes a lot of difference in the eyes of those who gave you that name when you were born. The level of their religiosity. Why did they choose Hussein and not Ahmad, for instance? Symbolically, what does Hussein represent, for instance? What does Kurosh or Dariush represent? So you could go historically, you could go culturally, you could go religiously, you could go dogmatically. You can attach a lot, not that you would attach them to, those meanings are already there. The meanings are already there. So within your own culture, they matter. Within another culture, they matter. That name is your identity. It makes you who you will become, in many cases. And in some cases, there are just coincidental names too, like, I'm sure you heard the name Madoff, the man who made off with a lot of people's money. Yeah, was simply ripping people off. That was his name, and he was given the job, and he did it. Or, let's say, I think Petraeus, who was assigned the commander's job in Iraq, where they speak Arabic. And how do you say Petraeus in Arabic? Betraeus. Yeah, so he betrayed them, of course. And there are many names you can find like that. Of course, if you're observant enough, that somehow you find out that there is what seems to be coincidental somehow becomes that person's name, identity, and character too. So going back to the question of the ego, looking at a sea of humanity. And as I say, if they only knew that humans have identity in addition to their entity, they would understand why we kill each other. But they don't. Other animals, birds, when they go after a prey, they eat what they can, they leave the rest for others. That's it. What we do, we want not only everything for now, for ourselves, we want everything for posterity, for our future generations. And with it, we want not just the things that would be necessary for our survival, but we want them to establish our superiority. Remember, when we build walls, the understanding is that anything this side of the wall is superior. I am more important than you. One could argue that point. Look, I'm more important because whatever reason you give, but then you can't convince everyone with reason. So sometimes we resort to numbers instead. So I'm more superior because more people agree with me that I'm superior. And if somebody says, well, but wait a minute, the majority of the people are on the other side. Not too many people agree with you that you are superior. So what do? We try to change numbers. We attack the other side. We kill more of them. We destroy more of them so we can become the majority. So we can convince the people that, look, the majority is on our side, so we must be right, which is the white racist mentality in Europe and North America. Okay? We are deserving it. We are right. We have built, we have discovered, we have done all these things. These other people, if the color of their skin is a little bit darker or too dark, whatever, they don't even deserve to live. I'm sure you've heard that during the presidency of Ronald Reagan, he made the U.S. trade with Mexico contingent upon one thing. No, to make sure that the government of Mexico sponsor all the abortion clinics, keep them open. But at the same time in the United States, he was 180-degree opposed to that position, says, no, we cannot allow abortions here, which meant only one thing. The numbers of the browns across the border has to come down through abortion. But the numbers of the whites over here, they have to go up. Same president, same administration. Now, we have many more examples like that, and we can't argue this exclusively for the white supremacists. Other societies do pretty much the same thing. That is because, again, to go back to that first argument, those who are in the shadow and have not given up themselves, the self within, but somehow would have to show their superiority, and that superiority is done in gradation. I'm superior, but I can accept you only if you think like me. If you share my idea, if you share my ideology, if you look like me, if you have the same pigment composition on your skin like me, if you believe like me, and if you don't, then I'm going to do everything possible to convert you, indoctrinate you, and in any ways, just you have to look like me. And we have seen, I've seen Palestinians who came to America, who came from the land of Jesus, and some of them were not allowed into churches because they looked too Middle Eastern. And these are churches that are built in the name of another Palestinian, like this guy who is denied to enter the place of worship. So therefore, the standard is what? The standard is, yes, even that Christianity that came from Palestine is not Palestinian anymore. It's European, it's North American, it's ours, so it is superior. So unless you look like us, we don't even accept your Christianity. And we have somewhat similar to a situation similar to that in the Muslim community. When sometimes I go to the Eid prayer in Vermont, and sometimes they do it in the convention center or a big hall, you see like a huge sea of humanity of all different colors. But then you see Nigerians dressed like Nigerians, like if that makes them better Muslims, right? That's what they perceive. Pakistanis dress like Pakistanis. See, faith and religion is in your heart. It is not in what you wear. But you have associated that with a particular culture. And I have a friend who happens to be not here today, but someone who knows him is here. He told me once that when he goes to the Islamic conferences, his white American blonde and blue eyes, he says that there are these, South Asian, North African, Middle Eastern Muslims who look at him with a kind of doubt, this is not your place because you look different. I think I made the point that this association part of it is the biggest catastrophe in human society, and that most of these wars that have been fought where hundreds of millions, not just millions, hundreds of millions have been killed, but 63 million in World War II, which is actually a European war, and a considerably large number in the first one, and it goes on and on. And what's the problem? Because we can't stand seeing them different. We can accept them only to be like us. But then the flip side of the argument is that when they become a little too much like you don't accept them either. If they look very much like you, it's the jealousy. If they look very different from you, then it's the otherness. And so it makes it kind of a puzzling thing, like, so what must we do? But we resort to a lot of things, equally displeasing as the wars. Take the concept of the thought, the individual thought. What we read earlier in the forum was that God is telling us that you have the right and the freedom to believe whichever way you want. And then some of us come and say, wait a minute, I understand that. But you know that some of these people, they don't really understand Islam, implying Islam is only what I understand. I am the standard of truth. What I believe must matter. And by simply saying that, I am the standard of truth, I have the monopoly over the truth, we have built one more wall. And so, if I, as an individual person, claim that it's bad enough, but probably doesn't cause any problem. However, if I gain a little more power and influence, and I have the power to implement my wish and my interpretation, then I'm going to force people to believe like me, or they are going to be in serious trouble. So, in the West, in the Christian world, we have the concept of apostasy or heresy. And apostasy is when a person says, look, I have been following this particular religion and faith, and I came to the realization that it doesn't convince me fully. So I give myself the right to believe somewhat differently. So you become an apostate to a particular religion. You do it by your choice. But then if the word gets around, and other people in that particular religious community hears, then they resort to heresy. Heresy is when the group tries to kick you out of that group, excommunicate you, push you out, because you don't believe the way they do. So whether you look at it from the individual's choice point of view, apostasy, or from the group mindset, heresy, in both cases it's the freedom of one's thought and one belief that is denied. The Islamic vocabulary would be ilhad and takfir. Ilhad means you move away. And when we talk about lahad, the stone, when people die, they put their heads on a stone facing Kaaba, right? Why is that stone called lahad? Because there's no point of return from there. That's the law. No point of return. Because you're dead. Okay, your body and soul and spirit have all separated. So since there is no point of return, they call that lahab. Now, ilhad then is a person who returns or turns away from a religion out of his or her own choice, which, as we read in the Qur'an, which is allowed. We have every right to do that. But according to the society, if you do that, they are going to excommunicate you, and they call you what? Kafir, a disbeliever or unbeliever, depending on the interpretation. And then they declare takfir, which is the heresy claim. What does that mean? It means they will not allow you to have that choice. Why? Because you're reducing their number. Remember the first argument? It is all a matter of numbers. The way we try to convert people from other faiths to ours, numbers. And it's kind of sad. But the bottom line is that you can analyze history, global politics, and all that. There's nothing but this one thing, that we can't give up on the otherness. We keep building walls to make people who would be much the same as us, to make them very different because they do not fit within our norms. So, when we go to a certain extreme in creating these othernesses and playing the number games, we get to kind of an evolvement that happens basically in three stages, psychologically speaking. In stage one, you become aware that you are the consciousness, you are the standard. You have the idea, and you're so certain, and that's the problem. The closer you get to the certainty, the difficult it is to dislodge you from that. And that's why I've often said that the best teacher in life is a healthy doubt. Always question. Because when you question, you will understand. When you question, you're operating God's greatest gift to you, which is your brain, your mindset. You are supposed to be questioning it. But in the dogmatic community, you question anything, especially when they don't have an answer for it, they're going to takfir you on the spot. They won't allow you to. So that's the first stage. In the second one, you become aware of the same, but above others. Yeah, I understand Islam to be this, and I know you understand it that way, which is okay, but at the end, understand that my understanding is superior to yours. So we even use knowledge for manipulation. And then the ego, of course, jumps beyond that, and we try to coerce people, we try to force people, we try to bribe people, we try to do a lot of things like in the immigration wave that happened in 2013-14 in Europe. The Christian churches were offering free citizenship of Germany to anyone who would just apply in the church, don't go to the immigration office. And you know what that means. And there were a lot of people who, whether they faked it or whatever, they just wanted the paper. So, what that creates within you, within that wall, is that when you start acting towards the others on the other side of the wall, behind the wall, you have to, and if you have the power to, say, convert them or coerce them, you can't do it yourself alone. So you'll have to gather large armies. Then you have to direct these armies to go attack this particular city, village, town, country. For what? The soldiers would think like, I mean, I have no reason. Remember Muhammad Ali Khali's rejection of going to war? He says, no Vietnamese has called me a nigger. I have no reason to kill them. Because he saw the humanity. Now, the fact that they took his boxing championship honors and things from him, that's a different story. But think about the armies. Why do people wear uniforms in the army? Because the first thing we do is we take the soldier's identity from them. Because the soldier has to become an extension of my identity. I have to tell them what to do. So if I want the soldier to do what it's supposed to do, first we have to nullify the soldier's identity. Any sign of distinction, of personality, of creed, that would make them stand up. They go out the door. What do the soldiers do first? Haircut. Okay, so they all look the same. Next, uniform. So whether they are rich or poor, it doesn't matter. Next, say, you do not ask questions. Because in the army, you follow orders. Which means their humanity is taken away from them, their personality is taken away from them, their distinction is taken away from them. Why? Because they have to become an extension of my ego. So when my ego finds it necessary for them to attack the next country, then the soldier will not say, why do I have to kill them? They're just like human beings, like me. So, first, that's what we do to the soldiers. Then we have to take the country next door, the country that's targeted for an attack. We have to dehumanize them. Because if they are humans like me, I have no reason to shoot. They have to be dehumanized. They have to be considered inferior in faith, inferior in religion, inferior in culture, in one thing or another. It's only then that the soldiers will shoot them. Take the US Civil War. Why did people fight? Okay, I won't go to the long answer, but the short answer is, yeah, they were fighting over whether the South should have slavery or not. But in one particular instance, when a ceasefire was declared, I think it was in some town in Pennsylvania, at the time they were using these guns that had to be loaded each time. And it was a very time-consuming thing. They found out that 93, after the peace was declared, they found that 93% of the muskets were not fired. Yeah, there were thousands of soldiers headed towards the other group. The south was coming from there, the northern from here. But the muskets were, 93% of them were not fired. And a substantial number, like 60-some%, were fired only once. Reason? The reason that fits our argument is that they saw the other side as human as they were. Same race, same religion, same nationality. So in the sameness, they couldn't kill them. In the sameness, they couldn't kill them. But if they were different, I'll give you another example. What was the most devastating weapon we used in World War II? It was dropped on who?
Yeah.
Why? We could have dropped it on Italy. We were fighting Italians. We could have dropped it on the Japanese. We could have, but no. We dropped it on the Japanese because the racial difference. We had a derogatory name for Japanese. So it was easy. And how many bombs did we drop? 2. Were they necessary? None of them are necessary. Japan was surrendering, they were accepting the terms. We had developed the bombs, and we were worried because we said, like, okay, we developed the bombs. If the war is over, we wouldn't know how they really work. So we have to test them. So a country that was surrendering, accepting almost every term of the American side, we wanted to drop the bombs, not so much that we wanted to kill them because they were surrendering, but we wanted to test the weapon. And these were good targets. These were Asians, they were different people, different religion, different tradition. It was easy to dehumanize them. And then if we killed them, they probably assumed that, people wouldn't really care much. And probably in the beginning, a lot of people didn't care much. And the reason for the two bombs is that we had developed a hydrogen bomb, and the other one was nitrogen or some other material. So we had to test each one to see how they work. I think we made that point there too. So we go through all of these stages, and the last stage psychologically is that if the wrong person with a big ego has a lot of power, that's when the greatest damage to humanity occurs. Whether it's Genghis Khan or Hitler or anyone. The world's greatest problems, whom or what do they blame that on? The reason all this killing of thousands of people is what? So some say it's all because of religion, right? Or it's all because of ideology. It's none of the above. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with ideology. It all has to do with otherness. The greatest catastrophe was that of Genghis Khan, right? Why did he do it? Because he was rejected twice. And the Mongols were desperate, and the Chinese wouldn't accept them, so they turned to Khwarazm to see if they would accept them. They killed their emissaries. And so Genghis Khan was saying, like, look, nobody even considers their equal. We are certainly going to die. But before we die, we better kill as many as we can. So it was they were killing out of desperation, not because they were brave. I mean, that would be a war tactic, that's a different thing. But they were certain that they were going to die, and therefore they were taking revenge on people who would eventually kill them. But they were so ruthless that nobody could even challenge them. So in that sense, humanity is tortured spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, in name of one or another ideology, religion, or any of those. And what that brings us to is the discussion on why do we think that way. The Qur'an is giving us two arguments. One is that repeatedly the Qur'an says in this book there are signs for those who think. So we are supposed to think, right? And then at the same time it denies us the coercion. Is that in matters of faith there is no coercion. So the right of free choice is given to us, and it's guaranteed in the Quran. Well, we can't go until the Muslims who are doing all the killings, because they are denying both of these. Free thinking. And I think that's a redundant term. How else can you think that is not free? They can take any of your freedoms away. Nobody can take your freedom of thought from you. Because if you're not free to think, you're not thinking. And that's not even possible. You can stop doing anything, but you cannot stop yourself from thinking. And when you start thinking, the thinking has to be free. So if you do free thinking, that is the greatest worship there is. That is the greatest worship, according to that same repeated verses of the Qur'an. In this, there are signs for people who think. And what we were studying earlier in the forum was that the Qur'an is giving you every opportunity. Learn through the word. Learn through metaphor. Learn through example. Learn through simile. Learn through signs in nature. When God says, like in the name of the night, walayl, wal-asr, all sorts of phenomena are presented to you to give you a much broader scope of understanding that thinking is part of that nature. And what's that nature? That your belief has to accept the norms and the standards of nature. And if your belief is not natural, then there must be something wrong with it. God is nature. What is the word ayah? Ayah, one ayah is the verse of the Qur'an, which those of us who understand it correctly, should never call it a verse. Okay, it's an ayah, it's a sign. So Qur'an is one book that has all the signs in it. Nature is the other, because the signs of nature are also called ayah. So we have two Qur'ans. One that's open and spread to all of us to read the pages. How does Sadi put it? So Sadi is saying nothing but making that same connection, that the nature is as much a Qur'an as the book is. Because the Qur'an refers to the word, to the signs in both with the same exact word. But of course, when we believe, we believe. Now, you can reason the faith, but the faith cannot be complete unless your heart moves towards it. And this was another issue we were discussing earlier, is that the heart is the core of your being. It's not necessarily this pump here. If you're moved to it, if you're moved towards it, then you have the belief. Then you have the certainty. So all of that is in the heart. And that brings us back to the three questions I asked earlier. And the first one was who you are, which puts us all into all of this trouble, identity. But the next two parts are what are you? And this can be answered in two ways. One, what are you if the entity is the physical one? Then we have to understand ourselves physically. The second one has to do with the spiritual. First, in the physical, what are you? Most of us think, when we think of our entity, who are you? Or what are you? Most of us see ourselves inside a bag of skin filled with flesh and bones. That our skin is the boundary of our being. Not so. If you are you, that is just this collectivity of flesh and bone inside the skin that is walking around, then you cannot have feelings shared with others, sympathy, apathy, all the pathy suffix words. That I think even in kinetic photography, they show us that sometimes you can take someone's picture on the surface and the hand is there. You move the hand away, take the picture, and the hand is still showing there. In other words, the field of energy remains there, outside of your skin. And there are many ways to argue this. So our problem in this regard is that because we see ourselves only within our flesh and bone and skin bag, the rest of them are defined in anotherness. The otherness we talk about, this is in the physical. So we see ourselves separate from others because, if Daesh chops somebody's head, we don't feel the pain. But if you have enough humanity, we will feel the pain. We will feel the pain. And it's not in the physical. And in the physical, we know that every day, or maybe several times a day, we look in the mirror. What do we see? We see ourselves changing all the time, evolving. We see ourselves dying. It's a continuous dying. We die in ourselves many, many times over and over. It's only when all the cells die we call it a death. But you look in the mirror and there is a reflection. And the reflection is looking at you and asks you this question. And the question is about your identity or your entity. Have you ever wondered that, well, when I was looking at that reflection in the mirror 20, 30 years ago, or even longer, it was different. Do you ever have any doubt that it's not talking to you? Never. So you keep changing. It's not the physical you that was there some time ago. And yet, you respond to it in a familiar voice, that the reflection in the mirror is talking to you. So the real you is not the flesh and bone and skin. It's more than that. And it's your spirit. The problem with spirit is that we often discuss it in religious context, and some people don't feel comfortable with that. And so they avoid it. And we don't have a more convenient word for it, but we can have that argument. The reason you would have to feel the same as everyone else outside of the boundary of your skin is that if you do a DNA test, you find out that we are all stardust. We are small particles that might have come from different galaxies and different parts of the universe during the Big Bang, after, I don't know when. And it's those particles that have come together. We are organic matter, nothing else. And as far as the basic elements go, I'm sure you're all familiar with the charts, we have the same. So what right do we have to claim ourselves to be different in the physical? We don't. And of course, we have no right to feel ourselves different on the spiritual, because that will take us to the next one, which is, what are we in the spiritual sense? In the spiritual sense, we are all one. And as I've talked about this before, spirit is the only word the Qur'an always uses in singular. All other words can be in plural, but not spirit. So there is one spirit that runs through all of us, that is energizing all of us. And so there we are all one. So how do we get out of this big problem? Well, one thing is that, remember the building of the walls? Creating othernesses on the other side of the wall? If we have the ability to reverse that, instead of having the wall standing erect, tear down the walls, one after another. Tear down the wall of religious differences, the walls of national differences, linguistic differences, and all of these. Once all the walls come down, which wall is left? One humanity. We are all one human. In humanity, you can't build a wall. Maybe you can build a wall against that eagle that's flying above the mountain. You could probably build a wall against certain other members of the animal kingdom, or is it republic now? But the point is that Once the walls come down, then we are all one and the same. But the tendency is generally the other way around. That we feel to have boundaries because it gives us a sense of superiority. And I had a personal experience of this otherness many Octobers ago. I thought that, well, leaving the country, because my life was threatened several times, was probably the only way out. But only when I left, at the moment I stepped out of the border, I had an awakening. And that moment is captured in a poem that is titled, This Otherness. I was a passenger on a southbound motorcycle. All the Afghanistan I owned was a dusty clump of earth, wrapped like a mummy, resting in my pocket, from which I was going to rebuild myself. Swerve past the checkpoint, I became a stranger in a blink. The longing began instantly. I turned back for one last look. Felt the presence of tomorrow's nostalgia. Will I ever see my country free again? A country in which I died many deaths and survived through hushed lips and a pretense that now reflected theirs. They made the plight only look impossible. They just wanted my country bled empty of its people. The motorcycle jackrabbit takeoff spun images wildly in a flashback. The haunting surveillance, the search for my brother's body, the delivery of the death threat letter, the last words I scribbled on the board the day I left the class untaught. Life, love, liberty. At the border between nowhere and nowhere, I stood facing the world to accept me. My garb, a stranger's. My accent, acceptably fake. My identity, a pretense. This otherness I tried to own didn't know me. The I was no longer. The I was to become had not yet eased into my being. My disguise succumbed to hungry gazes. No freedom, no redemption. A man took me to an office and said, "This is a refugee." A refugee? The word explained itself in layers of unfolding sensitivities, crushing my ego under its weight and demanding that I wear it as my new identity. I suppressed a loud scream within. I am not a refugee. Its echo triggered an avalanche of denial in the Baba Mountains of Afghanistan. All these years, I have watched that avalanche melt away into slush and gushing white streams that flow to the heart of the blue ocean, trying to convince me that I am. Thank you. Those who build walls are doomed, and humanity with it. I think we should reprogram our minds to build bridges instead of walls. When you build a wall, who is on the other side in the darkness? It's your enemy. There's a me in the enemy. And how do you say enemy in Farsi? So there is a man in dush and man. So there is their opposite. So you can explain it in different ways. Not that these are any scientific arguments, but I'm saying that there are certain kinds of subconsciously encoded messages in our languages that sometimes try to make us aware of it, but we don't pay attention to it. How many times were you thinking that there is a man in dushman? Probably not often. But if we see that there is a man in the dushman, you wouldn't kill them, will you?
What's the false from an individual human person to, of course, having an identity as a nation? Even within the nation, even here, it's a political party.
It's a matter of degree. Yeah.
So it's wars galore, whether we like this or not.
I think that's why my personal philosophy is that I believe in a world with no banners and no borders. If we are ever able to create such a world where there is no banners, no flags to salute, and no borders to separate us, in that case, the question that I've often been asked is like, I mean, that's not even possible that everybody is going to come to the United States. And I said, no, they will not come to the United States if you treat the whole world fairly, equally, and provide the same economic opportunities. And if life is good everywhere, most people get in the habit of staying wherever they were born. That's, humans are creatures of habit. So nobody will be coming here or there because the whole world will be one. The whole world will be nice. We will be looking at everyone as just humans, remember, with no walls. But then when you look at it practically, that's a nice dream.